Hi everyone, this is Subeda from Zephyr Lake Carmelite Mission. I hope you're having a good Lent so far. And today I'm going to continue my series on the Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. And if you remember, in my previous video, I skipped a few chapters from book 1. And I want to basically wrap up book 1 in this video. So I'll be reflecting on chapters 9 and 10 and also 12 and 13. Those were the chapters that we skipped last time. As you know, the book 1 is on the sensory night that the soul goes through, and book 2 is on the spiritual night. And in chapter 9, St. John of the Cross speaks of the signs that are observed by a person who is going through the sensory night of purgation. And we know that the night has two kinds. One is a passive and an active. The active night is what the human effort that we put in, and the passive night or the dark night that we go through is a work of God alone. And we have in book 1 sensory night, and the book 2 he speaks of the purgation of the spirit, that God, the work of God in the spirit. So today we will wrap up book 1, and some of the signs that we will observe is in prayer we have no satisfaction. So aridities and dryness in prayer, and warning here is that it can sometimes, aridity and dryness in prayer can come from our imperfections and sins. So he says we need to know the discernment, the signs for discerning what is truly the night of purgation versus what is due to our sins and imperfections. So the first one, he says, the soul that is going through the night of purgation does not get satisfaction in prayer, and it neither gets satisfaction from creatures and earthly things. Whereas a person who is in a state of sin or who's experiencing dryness and aridity in prayer due to their own imperfections will be able to get satisfaction from earthly and created things. But a person who's going through the dark night of purgation will not experience any satisfaction even from earthly creatures and the things of this world. This is so that the sensory appetite is purged and dried up by God's action on the soul. And the second sign is that the memory of that person turns to God, not towards earthly things. It is pained about not finding the satisfactions in things of God that it had previously experienced. So it remembers the satisfaction from its memory and it longs for that experience. So this is unlike the lukewarm souls that don't care much about serving God, or rather are not pained by the lack of spiritual consolations. While the senses are dried up by God's action, the spirit is nourished and strengthened, even though the soul is unable to experience or feel this spiritual goodness that is occurring in secret upon its soul through God's action. Like the Israelites who craved for meat, onions, garlic from Egypt when God provided them with manna when they were in the desert, similarly, the soul going through the sensory night is miserable because it is thinking of the spiritual consolations and satisfactions that it used to enjoy, not realizing that its spirit is being nourished and strengthened during the dark night of the purgation of the senses. These persons going through the sensory night will experience an inclination to remain alone and in quietude. And at this point, they are not to give too much attention to interior and exterior work, like too much reading or too much focus on exterior modifications, they should not give in to those things. They should be still, like God says, be still and know that I'm God, so that God can do his work without any hindrance. We are called to be still and to allow God to accomplish his work of transformation in us. The third sign is the person is powerlessness. So in spite of trying, the person is unable to meditate in the usual manner, the discursive meditations using one's imagination and will. The imagination and all its powers are subdued. This state can come in waves, cycles, or it can be a continuous experience, especially when the soul is still and it does not resist this sensory night that leads to contemplation. This experience can be continuous. The life of the spirit is peaceful, quiet, and satisfying to the spirit, while the senses are dry and arid. The soul has no power because God is working on the soul by progressing the soul from meditation to contemplation. And then in chapter 10, St. John of the Cross speaks of what should a person who is experiencing the sensory night required to do, or rather, how are they to respond to this? First, he says the person will be bewildered, and they may worry that they may have drifted away from God, like they may be far away from God's presence just because they don't feel his presence. They may try to force themselves to meditate. But St. John of the Cross says not to do that. He says to be still, to relax, to just be in God's presence and let God transform us rather than trying to force ourselves to meditate. Because it is like going backward and trying to interrupt God's work in us. And persons going through the sensory night may overly focus on their sins and negligences, thinking that those may have caused this dryness in prayer. Again, here, we are asked to not worry about such things, but to feel comforted, to persevere, and to trust in God, who is doing what is necessary in us to lead us to the clear and pure light of love. So before that, the soul must also, before the soul experiences the pure and clear light of love, the soul must, St. John of the Cross says, must also pass through the night of the spirit that will be discussed in the next book. In the upcoming videos, I'll be reflecting on those. But a person in the sensory night must just remain restful, must remain in quietude, must not force oneself to meditate, but just to remain still in God's presence, even though you may think you are working or wasting your time, to be patient and to be persevering in prayer, to free yourselves from all these preconceived ideas, thoughts, and imaginations, and just to remain still in the loving and peaceful presence and attentiveness, attentive to God's presence, look, peaceful attentiveness to God himself, and not to worry about anything else. Then in chapter 13, St. John of the Cross speaks of the benefits of the sensory night. So actually, both in 12 and 13, he speaks of the benefits of the sensory night. In chapter 12, he says the soul is the benefit, one of the benefits of the sensory night is that the soul is now nourished with infused contemplation, which is the food of the strong, the more spiritually mature. And the beginners are nourished with the milk, which is the food of the babies, whereas those who experience infused contemplation and the dryness, they are experiencing or they are being nourished with the food that is for the spiritually strong. And the individual, again, he says, gains greater self-knowledge and keen awareness of their imperfections that is in one's soul. And because of that awareness, the soul's conversation with God is more respectful, it's more courteous, it's less daring, and whereas the beginners are less reverent, they are more familiar with God. But now the soul, because it has a greater self-knowledge, has this acute awareness of God's holiness and the lowliness of the soul itself. So in this infused contemplation, God is pouring himself into the person. So while the person remains still and receptive, they are not hampering this infusion of God's own knowledge. So the self-knowledge and God knowledge is growing. God's own memory, God's own will, and God's own intellect is infused into the person, so we can grow in faith, hope, and love. And because of this self-awareness, the God awareness or the God knowledge also increases dramatically in the person going through this sensory night. So awareness of God's holiness and the lowliness of the souls. The soul is given knowledge of God, of his grandeur, his majesty, his divine wisdom, and God pours in the soul his own divine wisdom, for now the soul is empty and open to this divine communication. Also, the person is now detached and is able to hear the voice of God and is able to understand not through its own faculties, not through our own faculties, but through God in the spirit, is able to understand and grasp to some extent the lowliness of the human person and the magnanimity of God. So the self-knowledge leads to God knowledge. And both the self-knowledge and God knowledge increases in this phase of the sensory night. In chapter 13, St. John of the Cross speaks of the person, in relation to the 7 capital vices, the imperfections of the 7 capital vices that the beginners experience. The person going through this dark night is freed from the imperfections from the 7 capital vices. As an example, he says avarice with regards to spiritual objects and spirit is gone all of a sudden, and spiritual lust, spiritual gluttony, and many more imperfections are subdued because the soul no longer experiences any satisfaction in either the earthly or the heavenly things. This avarice, lust, gluttony is reduced. Humility increases with the self-knowledge and God knowledge, and openness to God increases. And in the middle of this dryness and aridity, the person remains tranquil and peaceful. And the person experiences a habitual remembrance of God and fears spiritual backsliding. The soul exercises all of the virtues and exercises more perfectly the love of God. And these are infused virtues. Not only the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, but also the cardinal virtues and moral virtues are exemplified in the soul. And he further uses the reference to Psalm 77, verse 2 to 6, where David speaks of a similar experience. And he gives 4 benefits from the sensory night that the person will obtain. Just in summary, he says, the delight of peace, a habitual remembrance of God, and concern or solicitude concerning God is basically an increase in God knowledge. The magnanimity of God is more aware acutely by the person. Cleanness and purity of soul, and the practice of virtue. And then continuing with the 7 capital vices, St. John of the Cross speaks of the soul obtaining also the virtues opposite to each of those vices, including that of anger. Now the person is more patient, is not able to get impatient, no longer has envy, does not experience sloth. All these virtues this person experiences because the person becomes more meek towards God, themselves, and towards others. They are so completely transformed that they are no longer able to become impatient or angry. That is the opposite of the vice of anger. And they become more charitable towards others, and they are no longer susceptible to envy. They're always putting the interest of others before their own interests, and they're no longer slothful from trying to obtain spiritual gratification. They're not trying to force themselves to sit and sleep, trying to read spiritual books or trying to meditate, but rather they realize, they accept this as a phase that they're going through with God's work in their soul. And then God occasionally, even when persons are going through this sensory night, provides a soul with spiritual sweetness. But this time, the spiritual sweetness is far more intense than the soul has experienced collectively in all the previous spiritual communications before it went through this journey of the sensory night. So it is of a greater intensity, the spiritual sweetness that the soul experiences, that God will occasionally provide the persons going through the sensory night. And the soul enjoys the fruits of the Holy Spirit, and the soul has calmed all the four passions of the will, the joy, sorrow, hope, and fear. And the person is totally transformed, and the soul experiences a harmony because the human person is in harmony with God in all its intellect, memory, will, and its spirit is in union with God, and the person has all their exterior appetites stilled and quieted. So they almost appear like a brand new person because they have transformed so completely by aligning themselves into what, or allowing God to align them to what God had intended for them from the beginning by quieting their sensory appetites and by infused knowledge, infused virtues, infused contemplation. So that's what we see in the book 1. That brings us to the end of book 1. And in my next video, I will be beginning book 2, where we will speak of the spiritual night, this night of the Spirit. And as John of the Cross says, the night of the Spirit is far more intense and more dry and arid than the sensory night. So that's what we look forward to in the next video. I pray that you will have a good rest of Lent. Continue to pray for me as I go through my Lent this year. So far, so good. Continue to pray for me, and I will be praying for you. Thank you. Have a blessed day.